This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it's time for another deck history video. In this series, I trace the history of prominent competitive Magic archetypes from their origins all the way through to the present day. As usual, I ran a poll to determine the topic of this video, and land destruction decks won against Spirit Tribal in a landslide, so that's the topic of this video. I will say up front I have some bias here because I have a special place in my heart for land destruction decks as I played them in Standard and Extended in the early 2000s, so I'm pretty excited that this type of deck won, as I have more personal experience with it than just about any other archetype, except maybe Goblins. For the purposes of this video, land destruction deck refers to any deck where a major component of that deck's game plan is to blow up the opponent's lands. This refers to a wide range of decks in Magic's history, and we'll be looking at decks like Erhnamgeddon, Ponza, and Eminent domain. I do want to note I'm not including Blood Moon decks if they only run Blood Moon as their mana disruption effect, as obviously enough this isn't actually land destruction. However, if a deck plays Blood Moon and some land destruction, I will include it here. Land destruction decks have found success in Block, Standard, and Modern, and in this video we'll take a look at each of those decks and discuss how and why they have changed over time. Before we get started, I just want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't yet. About half of my viewers are unsubscribed, so I'd love it if some of you out there would click that subscribe button. Alright, let's start with a look at Standard, where the first few land destruction decks emerged in the mid to late 90s. We're going to start with the first deck that I think we can reliably call a land destruction deck, and that's Erhnamgeddon, a deck that showed up on the scene in the Standard of 1996. This deck was by no means the first to run Armageddon, but it was the first deck where the game plan was based entirely around nuking all the lands. Erhnamgeddon was a green-white aggro deck, but one that planned on beating people by building up their board with creatures and then destroying all the lands with either Armageddon or Balance. Then you would be able to dominate the board with your early curve out, and your opponent wouldn't be able to get their shields up because they didn't have lands. The deck was really built around the idea that all the lands would get blown up, as it ran things like Felwar Stone and Land Tax, both of which would allow you to make sure you would be in better shape post-Armageddon than your opponent would. The Erhnam part of the name comes from Erhnamgeddon. This isn't a creature that has aged super well, since a 4-mana 4/5 with a downside is something we wouldn't be happy with today, but back in 1996, Erhnamgeddon was one of the most efficient creatures the game had ever seen, and the downside of the card, which is that it gives Forest Walk to an opposing creature, that downside just doesn't matter if there aren't any lands on the table. This deck put up some impressive finishes in the Standard of 1996. There were a lot fewer major events back then, but there were still 4 Erhnamgeddon decks that finished in the top 8 of various events that year. Eventually, key components of the deck rotated out of Standard, and that meant the end of it. But Erhnamgeddon occupies an important spot in the history of land destruction decks, since it was really the first deck to feature such effects so prominently. From 1998 to 1999, there would be another wave of land destruction decks in Standard, but to understand the origins of these new decks, we have to rewind a few years. I've already done deck histories on both Red Deck Wins and Burn, and in both of those videos, it was crucial for us to talk about Paul Sly, one of the biggest contributors to the history of Magic deck building. He was really the first player to realize how important it was to have a curve, and he was the first to create something that is very familiar to us today, a mono-red aggro deck. As I discussed in the Red Deck Wins video, 3 different mono-red decks are descendants of this so-called Sly deck. They were Red Deck Wins, Burn, and lastly Ponza, which first showed up in 1998. The creator of the deck was Brian Cowell, who won the Wisconsin State Championship with a deck he called Ponza Rata Red. Like Sly, Red Deck Wins, and Burn, the deck was mono-red and ran a lot of the same creatures, like Mog Fanatic, Fireslinger, and Org. But instead of running 20 or more creatures, Brian's deck only ran 14 and replaced those creatures with land destruction spells, which resulted in what was generally more of a mid-range or control deck. The deck used Stone Rain, Aftershock, Wildfire, and Wasteland to blow up opposing lands and make it difficult for your opponent to ever get their feet underneath them. Meanwhile, you'd be damaging your opponent with burn spells and your creatures. This marked the beginning of red-based land destruction decks, and that's why you can call pretty much any land destruction deck today Ponza. A quick aside on the strange name of this deck. Brian named the deck Ponza Red after a favorite dish of his. Ponza is basically a deep-fried calzone, and it's served at Jimmy's Grotto Pizza in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And no, this video is not sponsored by Jimmy's Grotto, but it is necessary to talk about this restaurant to discuss the history of Magic's land destruction decks, as strange as that sounds. So you might think that this deck name sounds like a random food item, something that isn't completely out of place in the history of Magic deck names, but Brian Cal actually had a rationale for naming his deck after this dish. A Ponza had 3 major components: crust, cheese, and sauce. Brian Cal's deck also had 3 main components: creatures, land destruction spells, and burn spells. This made it different from typical red deck wins, which only had creatures and burn spells. Ultimately, the name was shortened from Ponza Red to just Ponza, and it's still a deck name we use almost 25 years later. It can be used pretty broadly to refer to any red-based land destruction deck, though we have seen different names used for those decks over the years. Anyway, Ponza decks went on to find a lot of success in the Standard of 1999. At Worlds in 1999, 2 Ponza decks finished in the top 8. As you can see from Mark Lepine's deck, the layers of the Ponza deck are still in place. There's cheap creatures, some burn, and some land destruction. One of the big new additions was Avalanche Riders, which gave the deck a creature that was a land destruction spell, and one that could often either get in for 2 or trade with something, or even stick around if you wanted to pay the echo cost. Pillage was also featured in this version of the deck, as it was a pretty great land destruction spell. It still costs 3, like most good land destruction effects, but it also gives you the ability to blow up problem artifacts. Another deck with the Ponza name didn't find success in Standard again for several years, but there was another land destruction deck that emerged in the same year, and at the very same event actually, and that was a deck that was way more all-in on Wildfire. At the very same Worlds in 1999, Kai Budda won the event with his Wildfire deck. His version of the deck was really all in on Wildfire, as it played a bunch of mana rocks with the intention of quickly casting the powerful spell, which it could also accelerate into thanks to lands like Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. Once you did cast Wildfire, which was pretty much a foregone conclusion, you would be left with all of your mana rocks, and you'd still be capable of doing stuff even without your lands. Meanwhile, the opponent's board would be wiped, and they probably didn't have any lands left. It also didn't hurt that Covetous Dragon was large enough to survive the 4 damage and could then quickly close out the game. The deck doesn't run any land destruction outside of Wildfire, but the card was so central to the strategy that I think we can still call this a land destruction deck. A deck with the Ponza name also found success at the URZA'S Block Pro Tour, with Casey McCarroll finishing in first with his deck. As you can see, this Ponza deck is actually blue-red, and it varies significantly from the Ponza decks that dominated Standard from 1998 to 1999. For one thing, it only includes 3 creatures, and for another, the only land destruction spell the deck uses is Wildfire. However, it shows the shift in how the name Ponza was applied. It might have started out specifically as a mono-red deck that ran a decent number of creatures and burn spells and land destruction, but over time, it came to apply to just about any land destruction deck. Now, let's return to Standard, where a few new land destruction decks would emerge from about 2005 to 2006. This is the part of the video I have personal experience with, as I played many of these decks. One of these was called Eminent Domain, which I think is one of the game's best deck names ever. In fact, it came in at number 3 on my MTG Top 10 on deck names. Fittingly enough, this deck first showed up at 2005's Wisconsin State Championship, making it the second land destruction deck to be born in the great state of Wisconsin. Adrian Sullivan won the whole event with his deck, and it bears some similarity to the Wildfire decks that showed up in Standard in the late 90s. For one thing, it runs Wildfire, and that's a huge part of the game plan, but the deck also does something pretty creative. Instead of just blowing up lands, it can also steal them with Annex and Dreamleash, and that's where the Eminent Domain name comes in. If you want to hear me go deeper on that deck name, if you don't know what Eminent Domain is, go check out my MTG Top 10 on best deck names. But yeah, you could steal opposing lands, which allowed you to ramp, and also meant you'd have plenty of lands to sacrifice to Wildfire, and your opponent wouldn't. Meanwhile, you had 2 really scary dragons in the deck in the form of Kokusho and Keiga, who could really take over the game. By 2006, a new deck bearing the Ponza name showed up in Standard, and this deck was called Blue-Red Ponza. This is another land destruction deck I played with in 2006, and while it doesn't steal lands from the opponent, it's still a pretty sweet land destruction deck. This deck first found success at French Nationals in 2006, and the deck ran Stone Rain, Demolish, and Wildfire to blow up opposing lands. It also featured Eye of Nowhere, which could be used to bounce lands. It ran a ton of sorceries in general, which made Magnivore into an amazing win condition for the deck. Magnivore is one of my favorite cards ever to this day because of this deck. It would quickly get big enough to survive Wildfire, and could win the game in a couple of swings after the board had been cleared. This really brings us to the end of land destruction decks in Standard, as since 2006 there hasn't really been any deck that featured land destruction as a prominent aspect of the deck's strategy, at least not at the highest level of competition. This is partly because Wizards has really de-emphasized land destruction and powered it down, especially in Standard. Apparently not everyone thought it was fun to get their lands destroyed, and we basically never see 3-mana land destruction spells printed anymore, and that's made it pretty challenging for such a deck to find success. However, there is still one format we have to talk about, and it's the format where Ponza decks have managed the most consistent success, and it's still a format where Ponza decks are relevant, and that's Modern. These modern land destruction decks are typically red-green and have a variety of names in addition to Ponza, such as Gruul Landloss or Utopia Gruul, and while there might be some minor differences between them, they are all land destruction decks. They're basically all just Ponza variants, and that's the broad umbrella term we'll put them under. Red-green Ponza first really arrived on the Modern scene in 2016. Dan Wren became the first to top 8 with the deck at a significant event, which he did at the World Magic Cup qualifier for Scotland. As you can see, Dan's deck features significantly more creatures than we saw in the later Ponza decks that showed up in Standard. It has a total of 14 of them. It still runs a ton of ways to blow up or otherwise interact with lands, of course. Actually, adding green to the deck gave it plenty of ways to do that, in addition to Stone Rain, with the deck running Beast Within, Mwanvuli Acid Moss, and Primal Command. Beast Within comes with a ton of added flexibility, as it can hit a whole bunch of permanents, or even your own if you really need a 3/3. Mwanvuli Acid Moss ramps you while also blowing up a land, and Primal Command can let you put a land back on top of the opponent's library, while also granting you an additional effect. This is also the first Ponza deck we've seen run Blood Moon in the main deck. This powerful enchantment can really shut down a lot of decks in Modern that are reliant on their powerful non-basic lands, and it also makes it a lot easier for you to get enough land destruction going, as you can just blow up their basic lands that produce mana they actually need, and often ignore the non-basics. One of the major features of red-green Ponza decks in Modern is that the deck is also a ramp deck, so its overall game plan is to cripple opposing mana bases, while also gaining a ton of extra mana, a strategy that can really allow you to get ahead. As you can see, Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf are in the deck. Each is good individually, and combined they can give you a ton of mana in a hurry. Utopia Sprawl is the reason this deck is sometimes also known as Utopia Gruul, and the deck can basically operate like a ramp deck early if it needs to, and just slam an Inferno Titan, or it can play a more disruptive land destruction game, though frequently it ends up doing a little bit of both. In 2017, versions of the deck showed up in Modern a lot more, with the Magic Online user Abom Diggity the first to top 8 a Magic Online Championship Series event with the deck. While his deck's name was technically Gruul Landloss, you can see it doesn't vary a ton from what we saw in Ponza decks from 2016. The biggest difference is that the deck trims back a little bit on the land destruction in favor of more creatures, allowing it to have a little more of an aggro game, kind of like earlier Ponza decks, but it still jams in Acid Moss, Stone Rain, Primal Command, and Blood Moon, making mana denial a major aspect of its strategy. In the more recent past, Ponza decks in Modern have gotten some pretty significant upgrades. First, in 2018, Bloodbraid Elf was unbanned, and its ability to add to the board while cascading you into another card was great. Then in 2019, Pillage was reprinted in Modern Horizons, giving modern land destruction decks access to one of the old standbys of Ponza decks from the 90s. These Ponza decks don't utilize quite as much land destruction as we saw in 2016 and 2017, but the deck can still go by that name, as mana denial is still a major aspect of the deck. After all, it uses both Pillage and Blood Moon. One of the sweetest things the deck can do is cascade into either Pillage or Blood Moon, effectively making Bloodbraid Elf into a land denial spell too. If we fast forward to today, we can see that the deck's game plan hasn't changed a ton, but several very recent cards have found their way into the deck. It's become a more creature-based deck, now running the powerful 1-drop Ragavan, who can pressure the opponent early while also giving you treasure to accelerate your mana, and the new dragon Moonveil Regent, which gives you a nice win condition that gives you value almost no matter what your opponent does. Klothys has also become an important card in modern Ponza decks, as it can both help you ramp and pressure your opponent with damage, while also gaining you life and letting you make the game go longer against aggro decks. Ponza decks right now are by no means high up in the modern power rankings, but it is a deck that's always on the fringe, and it wouldn't surprise anyone to see it put up an impressive finish at any given event. Well, that's the history of land destruction decks. If you want to have a say in the topic of the next video, don't forget to vote in the poll on the community tab. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future content, you can subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past editions of Deck History, and there are over 25 of them, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.